The final From Software bosses tend to be some of the coolest bosses ever made, but they can also be just complete disappointments as well sometimes, and that is also true for their drops, which for today we are going to cover all 13 of them and rank them from worst to best. It is not just going to be their weapons, we're also going to include the spells, catalysts, and even Sekiro combat arts as well. But that's as far as I'm going to extend it. It's not going to cover any like of the really old games, and I'm not going to cover Armored Core as well. Also not going to include DLC final bosses. I already made a video talking about some DLC weapons. We're just going to leave this for like the regular base game. And it's just going to include the items that drop directly off the final boss. Or obviously if they drop like a soul or a remembrance, you can turn that into another item. But for this list, as always, it's just going to be based on how well the weapon performs inside of its own game. And it's just going to be for PvE. Which, speaking of PvE and great games, I was fortunate enough to play an early version of Mandragora, a new dark fantasy action RPG that also has some Souls-like combat, and honestly, I was genuinely impressed. I get lots of requests about showcasing indie games all the time, but this one really stood out to me from not only a gameplay perspective, but also based on quality too. The smoothness of the dodging, the hitboxes, spell combat, the music is amazing, but probably the biggest separator for me that had me really impressed was its voice acting and cutscenes. They have these really cool hand-painted cutscenes that really show off the art direction and atmosphere, and there are just so many high-quality voice actors too. Some might end up sounding familiar, namely the voice of Morgoth, and Geppetto plays one of the main characters in this.
Most spirited animal I've ever seen tamed. I thought her screams would wake the dead.
Like, I was just having a blast playing it. I appreciate the pacing of the game, the visuals, unlocking different abilities, being able to teleport between checkpoints, actually having mana and stamina cost for your weapons be visible on the screen. There is definitely a lot of thought and care that went into this game, and it shows. So if you're looking for a nice 2.5D Souls-like experience with good customization, great level design, many different classes that all have their own detailed skill trees, then you should definitely consider pre-ordering Mandragora, as it does release on April the 17th. So please click the link in the description to pre-order or find out more. Starting off at the bottom, the Scythe of Want, which is one of 3 different weapons that you can transpose from Nashandra's soul, and this one being the worst amongst them for many reasons. One, it's a Reaper or a Scythe, and this is one of the worst classes in the entirety of Dark Souls 2. One, they get sweet spot damage, therefore if you actually don't hit with the blade of the weapon, you're doing like 2 to 3 times less damage, which is just stupid. Like, none of the other games had its sweet spot and sour spot damage be that big of a discrepancy. Their movesets are just not that good at all. The follow-up light attack just always misses. They always get some of the worst stats, like 110 counter damage and 15 poise damage is just ridiculous. Even Katanas gets more poise damage. And for the Scythe of Want in particular, you can't even infuse or buff it as well. Which there are so many boss weapons in this game that you can buff and infuse. Why is a Scythe of Want not one of them? Its heavy attack is terrible as well. Like, it can do some nice damage, but it has awful range, and it consumes your entire stamina bar. And the funny thing is, there is literally another Scythe in the Scythe of the Forlorn that also is split dark damage, gets the exact same moveset, but just more range and more damage because you can actually buff and infuse it. Number 12, the Greatsword from Dark Souls 1 of the Soul of Gwyn, which not only is a very disappointing weapon, but also an extremely disappointing boss, probably the most disappointing boss in the game because it has like 3 attacks that are not even balanced towards the game, and you can just parry the boss anyway. Anything cool about him is his OST and his design. Like, he was that bad that Miyazaki had to apologize for this dog shit boss, and the weapon is arguably worse, because it's just a generic greatsword with pure physical damage, gets a descaling in dexterity and strength. It cannot be buffed or infused, so therefore every other greatsword could potentially outdamage this thing. And the only thing unique about it is its heavy attack, which can flatten enemies to the ground, which might be useful in some areas. But when it comes to raw damage, it's not going to be that good, and using the light attacks are still going to be better. But I don't know why this thing didn't get like some cool fire effect, like what Gwyn actually has, you know, the final boss in the game. And the funny thing is about boss weapons in this game, you can only really get them until you're like halfway through the playthrough, and with Dark Souls 1, it throws you straight into New Game Plus, so you can't even get this weapon until you're like 1.5 playthroughs in. Number 11, Sunlight Spear in Dark Souls 1, which you also acquire from the Soul of Gwyn. And unfortunately, you have to be +1 in the Warrior of Sunlight Covenant and trade in this boss soul just to be able to get it. And not only do you have to be +1 in the Covenant, but you also have to stay in the Covenant just to be able to use the spell, which the spell has a 50 faith requirement, takes up 2 slots, and has 5 casts. Now, thankfully, This spell hits like a truck, can send smaller enemies flying, and actually goes really far. Now the downsides is just like all the other lightning spells, it has a really long animation, and the tracking can be a bit shit sometimes, especially at closer range. So I would never really use it if you are like in the heated battle against like aggressive types of enemies. It's purely meant to just pick off some enemies at a distance, or if you get further away from a boss, where it definitely can put a lot of work in. But yeah, the fact that you have to stay in a covenant just to use it, and that you only get 5 casts, stops me from putting it any higher. Number 10, the Bow of Wand from Dark Souls 2, another weapon of Nishandra's soul. And this is not a bad bow by any means, but you know, it's a bow. It's never going to really be a primary option, and you kind of just use them as secondary options to like pick enemies off at a distance, which actually is extremely beneficial in this game. Out of all the Dark Souls games, it's probably most important to carry around a bow in this one. And the Bow of Wands can actually be one of the highest damaging ones. It gets split lightning damage with its lightning scaling, and going onto a Faith build can really maximize the damage. It also does get a unique L2, which is like some Sunlight Spear type of attack. It literally has the exact same model and color as the Sunlight Spear spell, and I guess they added this in because Sunlight Spear just drops off Gwyn. So if you really want to think about it, there's actually a Sunlight Spear that drops off the final boss in every single Dark Souls game. But this lightning attack itself can actually do more damage than like a bow attack, but it consumes a lot of durability and has a long animation. So the only purpose of it is if you're trying to save on arrows, or just trying to like maximize your damage in one hit maybe. Otherwise, just using regular arrows is going to be the way to go. But yeah, I can't really put it any higher because it's still a bow, and it's only really going to be that good with a Faith build, where you're probably already going to have some access to spells. And with things like a Dexterity build, there are going to be other bows that can just do more damage. Number 9, One Mind, which is a combat art from Sekiro that does drop off Ishin Ashna, which is one of 2 final bosses. And this attack for 3 spirit emblems does do a very cool like AoE attack, which can be good for crowd control. Now the thing is, there aren't too many circumstances to where you're fighting groups of trash mobs, but it still can perform pretty good in a 1v1 situation. It is one of a few different skills that you can hold onto and like walk around and then use it. And if you're fighting enemies that use swords, they'll be trying to like to block the entire thing, and you can output a decent amount of posture damage. And even against like larger bosses that don't block, the vitality damage is still pretty good. You also do get a follow-up horizontal swiping attack option too that doesn't consume any additional spirit emblems. I think the best use of this skill is that if you're having problems like fighting a certain phase of like a sword-based boss, you can literally just spam this thing over and over again, and it can just straight up stun lock them because you can cancel the recovery animations just by dodging, and you can just spam it over and over. Also, when you do run out of spirit emblems, this thing is basically just useless as well. You don't really benefit of much of weapon buffs either, because the AoE is kind of more of like a projectile attack. And for 3 spirit emblems, it's just way too expensive. If this thing was only like 2 or 1 spirit emblem, it'd easily be one of the best in the game, due to how well it actually can cheese a lot of bosses. But unfortunately, there's too many downsides. Number 8, the FIRELINK Greatsword from Dark Souls 3. Now at this point, all the weapons I'm going to be talking about are actually really good, and I'd love to put the FIRELINK Greatsword higher because its unique skill is one of the best in the game, but the rest of the weapon is just mediocre, because this is a regular greatsword with just the basic moveset and just a shitty quality scaling, only a D scaling in strength and dexterity, and for some reason no faith and intelligence scaling. Like, it gets split fire damage. Where's the faith and intelligence scaling like all the other fire-based weapons? So even at high levels of strength and dexterity, it can get out-damaged by almost every other greatsword. And this thing is literally the bonfire weapon that you can impale into the ground. So where is the poking attack? Where's the poking heavy? Where's the unique moveset? It is like way too generic, but thankfully its skill in Ember is actually really good. If you haven't played Dark Souls 3, yes, it kind of looks a bit like the Blasphemous Blade attack, that it fires off like a fire-based projectile in a straight line. Now, no, it does not really go that far, but it actually does do some decent damage. You actually get insane amounts of hyper armor. Like, this thing can get more hyper armor with its skill than like the Rings Knight paired greatswords. And the thing is, this fire trail attack can actually hit multiple times, and every single one can stagger enemies. It can send them flying to the ground. It can do amazing poise damage, and for only 25 FP. And on top of all that, it actually does buff the weapon with some more fire damage too. So it's actually an amazing skill. It's an S tier skill. It's just on a very mid weapon. Number 7, Dragon Flash, which is another combat art in Sekiro, this one being of Sword Saint Ishin, and it basically is your only true projectile combat art in this game. And this thing actually can go pretty far, and as I always mentioned with projectile attacks, they can cheese a lot of bosses because you can set at a further distance, not have to engage with an enemy. Now in this game, a lot of bosses tend to be pretty aggressive, so you're not going to really benefit much off this projectile attack, but it obviously does do some bonus damage at point blank range because it gets an additional hitbox. but you could literally sometimes miss at point blank range because the tracking is a bit off. And obviously if you're a combat art that's doing some type of like some diagonal swipe, we have to compare it to Mortal Blade, and it's just never going to really beat that one out. And the uncharged version of Dragon Flash is pretty mediocre, and you only really want to use it fully charged, just the benefit of that projectile attack. So it's useful to have once enemies get a bit further away from you, or to like pick some enemies off at a further distance. And the fact that it's the only combat art in the game that can do that makes it useful. Number 6, the Burial Blade. Now, as I always mention when I'm making these videos, the lists are based on how well the weapon performs inside of its own game. And for the Burial Blade, it is an above average Bloodborne weapon in my opinion, probably around about like 10 or 11 I'd rank it, because the movesets both untransformed and transformed are pretty good. The Scythe version can be a bit slow, but it actually does overswing the weapon and have a very wide hitbox, so it's really good at hitting multiple enemies, or enemies like to move and dodge around. It does get a very good skill scaling, which skill-based weapons in this game I'm almost always going to prefer, because for some stupid reason your visceral attack damage scales off skill. The weapon also does get insanely high rally potential, so you can get your health back pretty quickly with this thing and help trade out, which might help compensate for the slightly slower moveset. Now in terms of the downsides that I have with this weapon, one, it gets split arcane damage, therefore you just cannot buff it, which not being able to buff a Bloodborne weapon is definitely going to be a major downside. And also the Scythe version heavy attack has an incredibly long animation, and it does go out pretty fast, so sometimes it's hard to line up your backstab. It can like send smaller enemies flying, which is pretty funny. So it's not the worst heavy attack, but I kind of wish it was like it's a bit faster, or actually had like the same animation as Gurman, because Gurman gets like a cool like double swiping heavy attack, but when we use it, it's just like a really long basic sideward swipe. Number 5, the Dark Souls 3 Sunlight Spear, which is the other item that you can get off the Soul of Cinder boss soul. And this one is the best miracle in the entire game, because it goes really far, it is really quick, and it does amazing damage. And miracles in this game are incredibly underrated. They're doing lightning damage, which is the best elemental damage type, and they can do some of the most damage, especially if you use the Rose of Ariandel, which is literally 25% more damage to your miracles for 2 minutes. And the funny thing is about the Sunlight Spear, it is really good at a distance, but it just does bonus damage at point blank range for some reason. Like you just do 70% more damage just being closer to the enemy. It's like the best close range spell in the entire game, and it's a projectile. The only downside that I have with this thing is that it does consume like 48 FP, so I would only really use it when you do have like 30 attunement or above, but you know, it is off the final boss, so you should be at a higher level anyway. Number 4, the MARIKA'S hammer in Elden Ring, which is one of the boss weapons you get off the Elden Beast Remembrance. And this, in my opinion, is the best hammer in the entire game. It gets a really good strength and faith-based scaling. Going into either or is extremely beneficial. Strength will actually help you output a bit more damage, but going into faith would give you better synergy with spells. Now, unfortunately, it is just like a regular hammer moveset. It would have been nice if it got the poking attack moveset, like what the Morningstar has, because, you know, Radagon does poke with the weapon. But with hammers in general, they have really good charged heavy attacks, and they're really good at guard countering, because they can output more stance damage and things like a Colossal Sword, but in a much faster animation. But even then, the best part about the weapon is its skill in Goldbreaker, which for 26 FP you become airborne and literally get infinite hype armor. Like you can never get staggered out of this animation, and you come crashing to the ground, which sends all these smaller enemies flying into the air. At point blank range, you can hit for 40 stance damage, and the recovery frames are pretty quick too, so you can spam it over and over again and just destroy basically everything in the game. The only downside is, as I mentioned, it is a hammer, so it's not going to get the best damage, and the good stance damage of the skill only comes when you hit with the weapon directly, but otherwise it's still deserving of an S tier. Number 3, the Chime of Want, which is the third weapon that we're going to talk about that you get off Nashandra's soul in Dark Souls 2. And this is the best chime in the entire game, as it does get like the best dark scaling. So if you actually wanted to go with a Hex build and castle your really powerful spells like Great Resonant Soul, Climax, Darkstorm, this is literally the best option in terms of damage. The Scythe's Chime does do a little bit less damage, but get faster casting speed, but it's not really that noticeable. Whereas the damage difference definitely is noticeable, and the Chime of Want also gets the benefit of having an A scaling in Lightning too. So if you actually wanted to benefit of using some Lightning Miracles, the Chime of Want is going to do that better as well. And typically with a dark build, you want to go into split faith and intelligence. But if you actually wanted to use some spells that have like a really high faith requirement, you can still benefit of just going into more faith, and you'll still get a damage increase. Whereas for the Scythe's Chime, you won't unless you level up intelligence equally. Number 2, the Sacred Relic Sword in Elden Ring. Now there are times where I get the question like which Souls protagonist is the strongest one, and the easy way to answer that question is if you just think about how the protagonist would perform in another game. If you put the Sacred Relic Sword in the Hand of the Tarnished and go to any other Souls game, it'll easily be the best weapon by far, because this thing is an absolute crowd control machine. Any single time there's a room full of enemies, it just clears them all out in an instant, because the AoE just goes out really far, it sends enemies flying to the ground, and they just won't even be able to dodge it at all, even against bosses where like the DPS is not going to be that high, but you can just keep running backwards and then keep spamming it over and over again. But even then, the weapon itself is still pretty decent. It has a good dexterity and faith-based scaling. It's just a regular greatsword moveset, so it's nothing really that special. Yes, the holy damage might be a problem in the base game, but the weapon itself actually does get more physical. You can still output a decent amount of damage to every single boss, and if you get a stance break, you're actually going to benefit off more critical damage because this thing gets 110 crit. The only downsides of the weapon is that the skill doesn't really melt bosses as quickly, and it does consume a lot of stamina and a lot of FP. But if you do use things like the carry and feel a good crest, and just have a decent amount of endurance, this is easily one of the best weapons in the game. And that's number 1, we have the SOULBRANT, or the Northern Regalia and Demon Souls. Now, technically the SOULBRANT is the final weapon, and the Northern Regalia is what you get by combining the SOULBRANT with the Demon Brand, but I can't really talk about just the SOULBRANT and not talk about the Northern Regalia, because in most cases, you just end up turning it into that weapon anyway, and that basically is just the direct upgrade. And both weapons kind of just work the exact same way. But yeah, the reason why this one does get number 1 is because this is probably like a top 3 weapon in all of Demon Souls, as it does get ridiculously high base damage, and it already comes fully maxed out with this high base damage. Now, it actually doesn't get any scalings in your damaging stats, but it does scale off your character tendency. Whether you have white tendency or black tendency, you will just get more damage. Now, specifically for the SOULBRANT, the darker your character tendency, the more damage you will do. Whereas for the Northern Regalia, you can just go either or. And if you have pure black or pure white, you can easily get over 500 AR, which for a greatsword in this game is just ridiculous, especially because you don't have to upgrade it, nor have to go into your damaging stats. So you can just go into things like health and endurance, and just be super tanky, which is actually extremely beneficial on New Game Plus, because in Demon Souls, enemies hit so much harder once you get to New Game Plus. Now, the only and obvious downside of the Northern Regalia and the SOULBRANT is that you can't buff it, and obviously your damage is going to be capped. So once you end up going to like New Game Plus like 4, 5, 6, you'll notice that your damage is not going to really be as good anymore, and you're probably better off going in a different direction. But it doesn't change the fact that for a good portion of this game, this is probably the best weapon to use. Anyway, we are now done and completed with that one. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. Also, don't forget to check out Mandragora, the new action RPG game coming out this April the 17th. It's an extremely enjoyable and addictive 2.5D Souls-like game that I know you guys would love, so definitely click the link down in the description or in the pinned comment to find out more. For the next video, I actually want to talk about level design. I'm going to make like a little retrospective video just covering the level design across the Souls games. It's mainly going to be talking about Dark Souls 3. So if that does interest you, definitely do subscribe and give this video a like. And I'll catch you guys around. Bye.